We're going to pick up in Chapter 3 called Gilded Age Politics, and it's on page 341. This chapter essentially deals with politics in this particular time period as far as what it looks like, how that beast, that political beast, is continuing to evolve. I'll tell you what I tell my seated classes, and that is that as I use the terminology Republican and Democrat, it still is not in the form that we know and understand it today. Now I tell my students that because it's important for you not to walk in with your own preconceived notions of, oh, I hate this particular party or another. And often what I find is that that can really inhibit your learning. So if you'll kind of wipe that all away, hopefully that will help you out a little bit. One of the things I do want to point out to you is that this time period is a very prideful time for America. Now, things aren't perfect. Things are not going always smoothly, but Americans are very focused on their rights. They have fought for, died for. They have moved forward. They have rebuilt the country. They are excited to be a part of the political machine, aka voting. And your book talks a little bit about how many people are voting during this time period that can. It talks about between the 1880s and 1890s, we see about 70 to 80% of those that could vote did vote. And that is tremendous. To give you a point of view or a frame of reference, just a couple years ago, our voter turnout was at an all-time high for us as far as within your generation and even mine at 57.5%. That's pretty high because just 12 years before that it was at 50%. So this is a pretty big deal to have that many people out voting because they can. They take it seriously. And if you talk to your grandparents, I remember mine talking in this same vein that it's a right, it's a privilege, and you better use it. So we see a lot of Americans voting. I would imagine that probably a lot of them don't know the issues the way we do. Obviously, we have access to things that they don't. The information overload is almost toxic sometimes. You know too much kind of thing. But in this particular day and age, they're voting for the party, and sometimes they're voting for the candidate, but rarely are they exactly voting on issues. And if they're voting on issues, it's things that are maybe a little bit obscure, things that we maybe wouldn't take into consideration today. For instance, your book talks about the tactic called waving the bloody flag, and this is something that we saw Democrats being represented as the party of secession and the Confederacy, and so the Republicans really would play this up as far as you don't want to vote for them because they're the ones that tore our country apart, or they're responsible for the war, sort of thing. We see at this point the Republican Party split, and they split in a very interesting way. We've got some pretty colorful terms. You've got the mugwumps, you have the stalwarts, and you have the half-breeds. Now, I'm not a huge Harry Potter fan. I've read a few of the books, but every time I talk about this, every time I read over this material, I can't help but smile because I think about, this seems like something out of a Harry Potter book. The mugwumps and the stalwarts and the half-breeds, you need to make sure and know all those terms. The mugwumps are what we historically refer to as the honest party in the Republican split. The stalwarts are the ones that are probably the most corrupt as far as if you're looking at it from a spectrum point of view. If you've got the mugwumps that are the honest and the straight shooters, you've got the stalwarts on the other side that are very much so, let's kind of massage the information, let's see if we can't influence government or the voters to do a particular thing. Somewhere in between are the half-breeds. They kind of straddle that fence, but often, your book points out, they're going to lean a little bit more towards the stalwarts. The founder of the half-breeds, or really kind of the main voice of the half-breeds, is one James G. Blaine, which is another name you'll want to know. Terminology-wise, you'd want to know about patronage. This is the practice that we see in government in this time, and maybe a little bit even now. I don't want us to feel like we're exempt from it, but this is where basically jobs are given to a particular person because of the support they gave to a particular party or an individual who's running. For instance, if I had been an active member of Obama's campaign and I felt like I brought 500 new voters to the table just for him, then I would have expected patronage and that I would have expected a job in Washington, D.C. Now, you and I think that's really ridiculous and corrupt and over the top, but this is pretty much the way it played out during that time period. Moving on, your book goes through several important names as far as who is running and what their place is in the world. One that's certainly familiar to all of you, at least the name-wise, would be Garfield. When he came to the table, he is the honest candidate. He's a professor, a part-time minister. I mean, he's like the full deal. And he even participated in the war, so there's certainly the military discipline aspect of it. When he won his candidacy, he was, shortly thereafter, after he's sworn in, he ends up being shot by Charles Guiteau, and you need to know Guiteau for your test. He is a guy that expected to receive some of that patronage due to his support, and when that didn't come through, supposedly he went mad. I probably was already mad at that point, a little bit crazy. He ended up tracking Garfield down and shooting him. He ended up dying essentially from blood poisoning from the bullet remaining inside of him. And his vice president, Chester Arthur, what a name, right? Chester Arthur is now thrust into presidency, and Arthur was not really a good guy to begin with. He's intelligent, but he was corrupt. He was part of the Republican corruption, and so when he became president, something happened to him. It's like he had a come to Jesus moment, so to speak. And that's my southern roots showing through, my apologies. But he ends up having this complete change of heart. He is not going to stick by the corruption that got him to that place in office, but instead he decides that he is going to go straight. He is going to be a reformer. He's going to support civil service. He is going to reform the tariff, and he really does disappoint some of his former supporters of the Republican Party. This, of course, does end up hurting him in the long run as far as when he runs for office again. We see another really painful election. We think things are dirty now, and of course they are as far as politics goes, but this all kind of starts during this time period. Cleveland, he's running for office, and a illegitimate son of his is found, and his enemies, his opponents, end up capitalizing on this. He does end up winning the presidency anyway. He's able to say, look, I did mess up. I had a child out of wedlock, but I support that child financially, and amazingly, for what a conservative nation we are at that point, they forgive him and elect him anyway. One of the great things that he's known for is the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which you need to know that for your test. It is the first significant federal regulatory agency in the history of America. And he is going to basically use this, as future presidents will as well. He is going to use this to propel his efforts at slowing down some of those titans of industry I talked about on the last video. In this point, he is going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act, which I've already mentioned, to try and slow down some of those mega companies, those monopolies. You also have the the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. My apologies. I bet I do that in the classroom too. And this was an effort to try and equalize the gold and silver. This is something that I won't spend a whole lot of time going over because I'm not an economist, but do take the time to read through it. As it's an important part of our economy, and it becomes a huge conversation piece with those that are running for office. So kind of read through that, make sure you're at least a little bit comfortable with it as we go along. continuing on in that particular chapter, you want to make sure you know who the Populist Party is. They're noted on page 348. The Populist Party is the People's Party, and they are supposed to represent farmers, the common man, so to speak. And they are trying to increase the money supply. They're trying to basically alleviate some problems that are coming up for most of the common men as far as money go. Number two, government ownership of the nation's railroads, telegraphs, and telephones. At this point, the idea of the Populist Party is, well, if we can shift control of those particular aspects of industry, things that would affect the farmers, they want to see that go into the government's hands rather than some wealthy billionaire who has no care in the world if the farmer can afford or not afford a particular good. Number three, they want to return extra government land of the railroads. What we see happening when the railroads are being built, they get a certain amount of land on either side of the railroad, and there's so much land wasted. There's farmers who lose a chunk of their land because the railroad has come through and the government has given them that land. And so farmers are saying, can we have some of this land back? If you take it over, then you could give it back to us. You also have the push for a graduated income tax, government-owned warehouses and grain elevators for the farmers to use, as well as the adoption of a secret ballot for congressional, particularly senators. And so these are some of the major populist ideas that come about. They have a good run for a short amount of time and are able to really bring some of these issues to the forefront. We see the rise of one William Jennings Bryan, who you want to know for your test. He is a populist who's a very strong contender for presidency. He's going to run against McKinley. He is a very active candidate at this point, before this point. Most of the parties are running for the president. Does that make sense? It's instead of the person running, as we see all these ads that a particular candidate is doing for himself. Back then, the party was the one that was running, because they were trying to say you as a voter should vote for the party, and whoever we decide is the right person, you would essentially be voting for. Well, this is different because Bryan decides he's going to get out on the road, essentially, and he is going to round up voters. He's known for giving something called the Cross of Gold speech, which is a term on your test as well, where he's arguing against greedy Wall Street goons, basically, that are burdening the farmers of America and making life that much more difficult. During that time period, you see McKinley run a totally different campaign. His wife is ill, and so his party is putting people on trains, and they are basically moving them to his house for him to give a speech on his front porch. Now, as a female, I think, oh, this is so sweet. It's so beautiful. He's taking care of his wife. But you have to admit, that's a mastery of political effort. In Chapter 4, it talks a little bit more about the war that we talked about in the intro, that the main kind of, I don't want to say that it started the war, because it certainly didn't, but it does play a role in it. A couple things I want to point out in this chapter so that you know what to study for. Alfred T. Mahan is mentioned on page 350. He is the author of a book called The Influence of Sea Power on World History. And this is a very important book for us as Americans. He is going to be the catalyst that really does propel us into a more modern age in the Navy. Because essentially his thesis is that we cannot be a world power unless we have a world power Navy. And so his ideas are used by one Teddy Roosevelt, who at this point is the Secretary of the Navy, and he says we need to be following his advice. We need to build up the Navy. This kind of becomes his pet project, and he's using Alfred T. Mahan's research in his book as his propellant. Also during this time period, we see this rush, I guess is the best way of putting it, of colonizing nations. We want to get out there, we want to take over a nation. Now, There's two parts to this, really probably more than that, but for my purposes, I'm going to tell you about two. Number one, it's a little bit of we need to have more raw materials. We need to have a set trade nation. We need more of a financial stability, and a colonized nation will do that for us. Number two, there's this idea of if you are not European or American, then you're a heathen. And so we are going to go out and do great good amongst the rest of the world by bringing them to our way of believing. Now, this sounds like a religious pitch, but in reality, what a lot of them are actually talking about, although they do use Christianity, don't let me get too far off that with that, but what they're talking about is our way of life, our form of government, our ideals and our culture, etc., etc. And so we see quite a bit of this. Now, this all plugs into Cuba because by this point we have discovered some of Weiler's dubious deeds with the Cubans, and they are at this point fighting the good fight. They're wanting their independence. They know how it worked out in America. They've seen other Latin American and South American countries fight for their independence, and they're ready. Their battle cry is Cuba Libre, Free Cuba, which is another thing for your test. And at this point, we have titans in the newspaper industry. You have William Randolph and you have Joseph Pulitzer, who are publishing these wildly scandalous articles that are just meant to inflame the American public to want to go to war to protect these poor people. Part of this effort is something called the Delome Letter. The Delome Letter is one that was sent from Spain that was basically chastising McKinley, and kind of how I explain this to my students is typically I mention I have a brother that's a few years younger than me, and the way we all seem to work with siblings, and you guys probably have the same exact experience. I can pick on my brother. I can give him a hard time. I can joke on him about everything. I don't, but I could beat on him or whatever, but you cannot. Does this make sense? This idea that you can't pick on my brother is kind of how this Delome Letter ends up working out, because the Americans, they don't really like McKinley. But they do not like at all that the Spanish are making fun of our president. And so we see a huge backlash when this letter is discovered and then leaked into the newspapers. And Americans are hot to try. And so now they're even more mad about the Spanish occupation in Cuba, and they want to see them out. We also see at this point McKinley, he is trying so hard to keep us out of war, and there's a quote in your book I want to point out to you on page 352. He tells one of his aides, "I have been through one war, I have seen the dead piled up, and I do not want to see another." He doesn't take war lightly, which I actually greatly respect in the sense that he's not jumping into a war. He's not a fast-acting president in this way, and he is really trying to make sure if there's any way we can stay out of war, he wants to do it. What we see turning around in March of that year is McKinley finally has to do something. Number one, he's going to send, he ends up basically making a case for cease and desist. He wants the Spanish government to grant Cuba self-government or essentially independence. And three, they want the Spanish to close those concentration camps. Well, the Spanish end up saying, okay, we're going to cooperate with you. But for some reason that I'm not going to get into today, America, we're too far in. We decided it doesn't matter, and within a couple of weeks, we go to war. We start by going into the Philippines. This is another harbor station for the Spanish, and we go in and we end up promising one of the rebels, who's a leader there in the Philippines, his name is Emilio Aguinaldo, and promise him we are going to help you kick the Spanish out. We have no territorial interest with you, which we do end up reneging on, but we are going to help you guys kick the Spanish out. We end up doing this rather quickly, and then we move into Cuba. In Cuba, you've got a couple of players. The Major General, William R. Schaffner, you need to know him for your test. He ends up being a big part of our invasion into Cuba. You see Teddy Roosevelt. He ends up forming a group of men called the Rough Riders, which you need to know them as well. Remember, he's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he's itching for war. And this is kind of an American thing, I think. When we talk about the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, this is no exception. American men at this point, we glorify, we romanticize war, and Teddy is one of those guys. He gathers up some of his roughneck friends. He goes and gets fitted at Brooks Brothers, which maybe some of you know what is, very high-end suiting store. He goes and gets set up in his fatigues, which probably that day and age Brooks Brothers wasn't doing fatigues, but he goes and he basically turns this into a glorious time, and his Rough Riders end up participating in the war. The difficulty here is that we are not really prepared for war on so many different levels, but probably the most important is militaristically. We are not outfitted with proper machine gun, or not machine guns. We're not properly outfitted with the right artillery. We have Civil War era guns that we're taking to this fight, and the Spanish have long since evolved. When we fire a gun, there's this huge burst of smoke, and they can see our bullets coming, basically. And the Spanish have perfected this gun that shoots without the puff of smoke, and so we never know where they're firing from. Another name you'll want to know is John Blackjack Pershing. He's on page 355, known for his participation in this particular war and his effort at Kettle Hill as he moves the American troops into a victory there. I'm going to stop there, and we'll pick up with Chapter 5 in a few moments.